Good morning. I'm Ed Larson. Welcome to where I live, just north of LA, on the coast, overlooking the Pacific. I had the opportunity last week to be at the Center for Free Inquiry and talk about my new book on Washington, Return of George Washington, which covers a time when he was living in Mount Vernon, and that's why it's good to film here, I think, because he also had a view like this. It was the Potomac, not the Pacific Ocean. Got to see sunrise over it every day, much as I get to see sunrise over the Pacific, or actually from here, rises over LA, sets into the Pacific. It helps me to see how much he loved that place. In preparing the book and the lecture that you're going to get to see after this, I've benefited greatly from being able to have a fellowship at Mount Vernon, where I got to stay off and on for over a year, right on the grounds, where I got to walk around the grounds, see what he saw. In the morning, I'd get to sit out on his portico, overlooking the Potomac, watching the sunrise. And that gave me a feel for the place he loved most, a place that so much was involved in shaping his values. It was there that he was a scientific farmer, bringing modern scientific techniques to trying to revive a plantation he'd inherited and no longer could function profitably growing tobacco because it had played out on tobacco, and he moved into undercrops. I'll talk a little bit about that in a lecture. I want to take this introduction to thank so many people that contributed. There's an old saying from the Middle Ages that was later picked up by Newton that I can see so far because I sit on the shoulder of giants, or stand on the shoulder of giants, and that's what I have been able to do on this book, because so many people have worked on George Washington, researched it, read about it, talked about it, and written about it. Now, I dealt with a period that is very little written about it, but still the background material was there. My thanks to a great extent go to the folks at Mount Vernon. They have an amazing team of researchers there. Mary Thompson, Doug Brayburn, just start a long list of people who I could call on, people working over in the archives. I could go over when I was working on the inauguration, and he wore an American suit. He made a point. There weren't many American suits back then of suit quality that gentlemen could wear, but he found a place, heard of a place up in Connecticut, and ordered a suit. I could go over and look at that suit, see the suit itself, see the brass double eagle buttons that I could write about. There were lots of examples like that, and the help of people like Mary Thompson and Doug Brayburn was just critical. It comes out throughout this. During the lecture, I'm not able to mention all these names. I talk a lot about slavery, or some about slavery, during the question and answer period, and in the lecture. There, Mary was very helpful. She's done great work on that topic, and Mount Vernon tries to be sensitive to the issue of slavery, which is a terrible blight on American history. Henry Wenick's book, An Imperfect God on George Washington, served as a perfect starting point, and he began exploring some of the issues that I raised here, and I want to thank him. Also, I talk in the book and in the lecture about the state of religion in that time and the intolerance that still prevailed in so many colonies and in so many states. Now, that had begun to change during the Revolution, in part because of George Washington, particularly because of the alliance with France, which was a Catholic nation. In so many of the colonies, Catholicism had been banned before the Revolution. That was beginning to change. Washington was vigorous during the Revolution to push that these intolerances of especially Catholicism, but these other alternative religions, alternative to the English Protestantism that tended to prevail in the colonies. And that had begun to break down, but then it was rebuilding after the Revolution, and I'll tell some stories about how Washington tried to get America back on the track, and part of the appeal of the Constitution seemed to many to be that it offered a chance to push back on those intolerances to Catholicism, to atheists, which were only really comfortable at that time in Rhode Island, and yet we have a member of the Continental Congress, in Confederation Congress, and also then of the Constitutional Convention. Gouverneur Morris, who cared, who thought deeply about those issues and reflected those views as well. He was a very close friend of George Washington. They used to go fishing together all the time during the Constitutional Convention and at other times. Washington loved to fish, and so did Gouverneur Morris. And that is Gouverneur. It wasn't he was a governor. I'm not mispronouncing the word governor. That was his first name. He became a senator. So then I guess he was Senator Gouverneur Morris. So these are people we get to look at. And I deal with those issues somewhat, but those issues, those religious issues, I know interest many of you. They're so complicated, the book deals with them more completely and more balanced, exactly how Catholicism was treated in the different states. There were pockets in Baltimore, of course, which had been founded as a haven for Catholics. There were pockets in New York, there were pockets in Pennsylvania. That's one reason why Washington could reach out to Catholics during the convention, which he did. He rarely went to church at this time, but he did go to a Catholic Mass once. I think he was thinking back to his times with people like Lafayette and the other volunteers who he'd become very close with, who had fought with him during the Revolution. He, of course, would reach out to the Jews famously and letter to them and working with Jews. That was the sort of country he was trying to create, and that's what I'm talking about in the lecture. Some places during the lecture and during the answers to questions, I have to cover these issues pretty quickly. I urge you to read more about Washington, his views on religion, and his views on founding this country. Thank you.
You're right, this book's called The Return of George Washington, and it deals with a period in Washington's life. But how does it fit with the other things I write? As you notice, I'm primarily a historian of science. Most of my works are in history of science. My forthcoming books are in that sort of same area. But what I do with my writing, I write articles on lots of topics. But with my writings, and if you want to notice a comparison, connection, is I tend to fill gaps in what other people haven't written about. There are lots of great writers who can take a topic that has already been written many, many times and tell it again, and maybe tell it better and get a best-selling book. I mean, you think of somebody like David McCullum and his works on John Adams, as if we didn't know what he was writing, and yet he told it so well, people wanted to read it. Ron Chernow did the same thing with George Washington and brought out a new biography of George Washington. It was a bestseller, and it was a great book. These are just historians who do this. And I tend, maybe because I'm not quite that confident, I love to do archival research myself. I love to just bury myself in the archives. And I also, I guess I'm not that confident. I think I'm a good writer, but don't want to take a topic that's already been written. So what I tend to do is I tend to take for gaps in the writing. And since I've taught American history for a long time, I can see those gaps. I've taught history of science a long time too, and some of them interrelate from my history of science, some from my teaching of American history. That's what my Scopes book was about. The Scopes book was that when I'd written that book on John Scopes, it's changed now somewhat, but when I wrote my book on John Scopes, the one that you mentioned won the Pulitzer Prize, no historian had ever written a book about the Scopes trial. There had been books. There had been books by a science fiction writer once wrote a book about it. It was good. A journalist, 6 Days Forever, Ray Ginger, had written a book. But no historian, and that meant nobody had gone back into the archival research and bring the techniques and the methods of a historian to figuring out what happened, the way a historian would look at it. Didn't mean, of course, Inherit the Wind is a great, great play. I got to be good friends with Bob Lee and Jerry Lawrence, who were the writers of that play. It's a great play, but it's not really about the Scopes trial. It's really about what you were talking about earlier. It's really about, it's about McCarthyism. It's an attack on McCarthyism. Doesn't make it less of a great play. But I could go back and try to parse out the story. And I did the same thing with the book on the Galapagos. Everybody talks about Darwin and the Galapagos. Well, no one talks about the other science. Why did Darwin go to the Galapagos? Did he discover it? Well, no, he didn't discover it. It was already a hotbed of science before he went there because it produced so many strange animals and plants. Plants and animals found nowhere else in the world because it was the largest area of land other than in the polar regions. It was the largest area of land in the world ever discovered by Europe, first by Europeans. And therefore the native plants and animals were still in the Galapagos, where every place else, even Hawaii or someplace like that, the Polynesians had been there and brought their pigs and their animals and basically messed up the local flora and fauna. And so when the Galapagos were discovered, humans had never been there. Mammals had never been there, except bats or flying mammals. No land mammals had been there. Well, and of course sea mammals had been there, things like whales swam around it and things like seals. But no land mammals too. So they could see a totally different environment there, totally different plants and animals. And it further, well before Darwin, it further pushed the questioning about the creation story. Because you see the Galapagos and you simply can't believe that, I mean, why all these, even though the islands are very similar to other islands, why all these totally unique types of birds and animals? What did God just decide on this one island to, on the sixth day, to create a whole bunch of special animals? It just didn't make any sense. And all these animals couldn't have gotten there if they were from an ark. It challenged the creation story 200 years before Darwin. So when Darwin went there, he had his eyes wide open. He knew it was a world-famous challenge to creationism long before Darwin got there. And that's one reason he insisted on having the beagle stop there. So I could tell that story by looking at science in the Galapagos Islands. I had a book on the 1800 election because, oddly enough, despite how important the 1800 election was for transforming American politics, basically the birth of the two-party system, there were books about the development of the two-party system. There were some wonderful books about the development of the two-party system. And they would always close with the 1800 election, but they wouldn't analyze the 1800 election in the same way that, say, Teddy White analyzed the 1960 election in Making a President in 1960. So I used the 18th election of that book, Teddy White's book on Making a President, as my model and went through just the election, and suddenly, well, the New Yorker said it was the best book ever written on the 1800 election. You could see what happened. You could see, and it was truly a battle of science and religion, with Jefferson being the candidate of science and Adams, even though Adams was really no more religious than Jefferson, being presented as the candidate of religion. And the science in Antarctica, the book I was here last for, was a similar sort of story that people write all the time about Shackleton's expedition, the one that totally failed, the one that he got caught in the ice and he had that wonderful trip out. It's an incredible story. People write about Amundsen and Scott getting to the South Pole, but they don't talk about the context. They don't talk about the science going on. And I found by looking at the science in the Antarctic expeditions back at that time, and National Science Foundation supported my research to go down there and spend quite a bit of time trying to figure out what scientific work was done by scientists. They had some Royal Society caliber scientists on those expeditions, and they weren't having anything to do with going to the pole. They were off doing research. And it turns out their research is the foundation. It's still used. It's the foundational research for all the work we do now in the South Pole. They basically discovered global warming. They discovered things like the emperor penguins, how they hatched in the winter. They discovered, made incredible discoveries on how the global climate works and how the oceans work. And they discovered that the Southern Sea is really the foundational ocean for the whole world, and that the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean are really bays out of the Southern Ocean. The Southern Ocean is a great one that goes all the way around down below, and that all those are governed by the Southern Ocean. and that the world's climate is governed by that great mass of ice. 96% of all the world's fresh water is frozen at the South Pole. Is in the 96% of all the fresh water in the world is frozen in mass. Over 2.5 miles thick in Antarctica. They discovered all that, and it had nothing to do with getting to the South Pole. And they went through trials as great as any that were gone through by Scott and Amundsen and Shackleton. And I got to tell them their stories, and those were stories of scientific discovery. They taught us that this world, for the first time, that there is a global ecosystem, that the whole world is an interconnected ecosystem. Nobody thought that way before. Before that, they thought of maybe the Atlantic, if they were broad-minded. Usually they thought of local ecology, but they learned that we have a global ecology, and then going back there, that is because that governs the whole world's environment. And if that gets messed up, it's going to mess up all of our world. Mess up, global warming, which is happening, and you can see it down there. It's going to change the world for us. Now, it will ruin the world? No, the world will just change. The world's great. The world is beyond us. But it might be a world that is not very conducive to us or to the species that are here now. They will evolve unless we do something crazy, like with either genetically engineered diseases or something like that. Unless we mess it up in some other way, it's a balancing effect. But you get to see it down there and experience it, and they first discovered it. So I got to write those stories. Now, then you say, well, how could you do that with George Washington? I mean, George Washington must be the best known person in the world, certainly best known person in the United States. Their library, you could fill a library with books about George Washington. That's true. Most of them are pretty bad, but you could fill one. And there's some that are very, very good. Some that are very, very good. Such as I mentioned Ron Chernow's biography, which came out. It's a very good book. It's the best one-volume biography. There are multi-volume biographies. One by Flexner, another by that's fabulous. I think that's 4 volumes. Freeman has a 6-volume. There are wonderful ones about certain incidents, like Washington's crossing, about his crossing of the Delaware and the significance of his crossing the Delaware during the Revolutionary War. There's some good ones about his presidency. But I learned that there's a gap in all those books. And that's the gap that this book is about. Most of the books about Washington are either about when he was general, when he was commander-in-chief of American forces during the Revolutionary War. For 9 years, without pay or with leave, he led the U.S. forces ultimately to victory. He was batted around at the beginning. He had to learn how to lead an army. He had to learn how to fight the British, but he did gradually. And with the help of the French, he won in the end. There's a lot of books about his presidency. He was the first president, and he sort of established many American institutions, like the cabinet as his presidency. Non-aligned foreign policy. Of course, as you mentioned, not being a religious state. Separation of church and state was established by the traditions of his presidency. There are some books about his youth, about how could a person grow up to be like this. I mean, he didn't grow up. He wasn't like Jefferson or Madison. He wasn't born into wealth. He was from his father's second marriage, and the plantation, such as it was to be inherited by his half-brother. And if his half-brother, and then he had another half-brother, who would have been the line in front of him. They both died, and so he thought he was going to have to work for a living, and he learned to be a surveyor, and he went out west, what was then west, the Ohio Valley, and did surveying, and he was learned the skill of surveying. He thought he'd have to make a living doing speculating in land and acquiring land and selling it as he was developing, as he was learning the West as a surveyor. So there's some books about it, and his service in the French and Indian War. But there's a gap in the literature that covers when he resigns as general commander-in-chief and when he becomes president. There's 7 years in there. If you look at his biographies, well, if you just conventional wisdom is Washington's commander-in-chief, and then he's president. And you just, boom, it's inevitable. Of course he's going to be president. Well, we didn't have a country for him to be president of when the revolution ended. When the revolution ended, we had 13 sovereign states. And those sovereign states were just that, sovereign. Many of them had established churches. Very few of them had freedom of religion. Rhode Island did. There were some that did have freedom of religion, but most did not. And that hadn't changed. It was a capital offense to not be, they were still killing Quakers in Massachusetts, and they were still prohibiting anyone from having a mass, and it was a crime to be a priest, and in most states it was illegal to be an atheist or an agnostic. Well, they wouldn't have called them agnostics, they'd call them an atheist. It was a crime to be that in many states, New York, for example, other states. The only place that was really comfortable to be an atheist would have been Rhode Island, really comfortable. Other states would have tolerated it, but most states wouldn't. They were all going off in their own way. The central government, such as it was called the Articles of Confederation, and that created a central League of Friendship. That's actually the term they use, League of Friendship. That was about as strong as the United Nations is today. Each state could send as many delegates as they wanted, but each state would just get one vote. To make any change, it required a unanimous consent of all the states. And no state was going to do that. They never could get any change made in the structure. It didn't have the power to tax. It didn't have any power to command individuals in any way. It couldn't command individuals. It couldn't command states. It could just ask them. It could ask them for a requisition. It could ask them to do things. It didn't control interstate commerce or interstate commerce. So naturally, each of the states set up tariff barriers against each other. And each tried to after the war was over, eke out its own survival. Of course, we all know Darwinian evolution. Who do you compete against? You compete against your neighbors. You compete against your brothers. I mean, you compete against your own species. You don't compete against other species. And so these states were competing against other states. And so they were fighting with each other. So New York was basically, they had the harbor, so they were exporting their taxes to Connecticut and New Jersey to get their goods to market, hurting the whole. There was no national market economy that could flourish and create a prosperous union. But even worse than that, they couldn't have an army, and because they hadn't paid the Americans. During the Revolution, they didn't pay them for the last 3 years. They didn't pay. Because they didn't have any ability to raise any money. Sometimes the states paid their own troops that were certain. And so, when the war ended, the treaty gave America, the United States, everything to the Mississippi River. But that was filled with Native Americans that had been traditionally trading with the British at a variety of forts like Detroit, other forts. And the British never left those forts. They kept working with the Native Americans with fur trading. The British had closed the frontier, everything west of the Appalachians, to settlement before the Revolution, in Proclamation of 1767, I think it was, which is one of the things that led to the Revolution, because Americans, by that I mean the white Europeans living on the eastern seaboard, all of them, Washington included, Franklin, you name them, believed that their future was on the frontier. They all believed that what made America different, what made America special, what made America a land of opportunity, was that people could always go west and acquire new land and make a life for themselves. If they were poor, if they were working class, they could get away from the established, just like that's what Los Angeles is all about, of course. That's why you have free inquiry. We want to get away from you're in these small towns in the East, and you're forced to think like everybody else and act like them. And I guess if you're in Salem and you're a witch, you're burned, or you're a Quaker, you're hung. And you can go to the frontier. That's why Ben Franklin left Boston and went to Philadelphia. And Franklin felt this way. Washington deeply felt this way. So did most of these people. That you can go to the frontier and do what and have your own life. And also, the rich people thought that they could speculate on Western land and get richer. So for both the wealthy people and the working class people, and Washington originally thought he was part of that working class. Acquire land, be a surveyor. Then his brothers died, and he inherited the plantation, and then he married very well, married the richest widow in Virginia. He was 6'2", and she was 4'8". No wonder they didn't have any kids. But he was able to expand his plantation. He already had his land that he had acquired by speculation on the frontier. So he believed we needed to go west. Well, the only way that the British had never left the forts. The Spain from New Orleans was pushing into the southwest. And our settlers were being pushed back. They had moved that way before the Revolution. They were being pushed back because, of course, the British and the Spanish, who were trading with furs, were providing guns to the Native Americans to collect furs, but they could also collect scalps. They could also shoot Americans who were trying to open the land. And America could do absolutely nothing to get them because we had no army, because we had no ability to tax. And that area wasn't owned by a state. It was owned by this Confederation Congress, which had no power. So no state was willing to throw. And all the states were struggling financially because after the Revolution, all of our money was, everybody wanted to buy. They hadn't been able to trade for 9 years, so they were all trying to trade with Europe. And so all the money was going, all the hard money was going over to buy goods from Europe. And so we had tremendous, well, it depended. We had tremendous depression in some states, tremendous deflation in some states like Massachusetts, leading to Shays' Rebellion by debtors. Other states have started printing paper money because every state was free to do what it wanted to. And states like Rhode Island and Georgia were just printing paper money like crazy. And then you had hyperinflation in those states. But every state was different. It was a mess. You think Greece and Germany can't get along in the EU. Well, it was a lot worse. They at least have a common currency that causes part of the problems, but it's a lot worse in this period. And we were actually, the frontier was being pushed back. Most of Georgia had been lost to the Native Americans. They were being pushed back all the way to Augusta and Savannah with the help of the Spanish. And same way in Washington's territories. And so we hear all about Washington. We're reading about Washington. We hear all about him during the Revolution. When I'm teaching survey in American history at Georgia or someplace, you hear all about Washington during the Revolution. Then you have a couple days and you talk about the collapse of the Confederation. And you hear Washington retired and went back to his farm, to his plantation, and he loved to be a planter. He was a scientific farmer. The plantation he had inherited was a tobacco plantation, and it had been played out. You couldn't really grow tobacco very profitably anymore because tobacco takes a lot out of the soil. So he studied up, and he totally reinvented his plantation. He used modern fertilizers. He would catch enormous amounts of fish and put them in. He would rotate crops. He shifted to grains, and when he was running the plantation, when somebody was watching him, he could make money. He opened the largest whiskey distillery in the New World to process his grain. It's terrible stuff. They still make it. It's absolutely terrible stuff. But it sold a big profit. Incredible profit. Made more money from his whiskey distillery than from anything. Terrible stuff. It's just like moonshine. You can go there and pay a lot of money to buy it if you want, because they still make it the old way. I helped them out because I had the pleasure of having a residency. I was the first fellow at the George Washington Library there, and so I got to spend a year in Mount Vernon. I came and went, but I had an apartment right on the grounds, and so I could walk all around the place. Nobody after the tourists, before the tourists come in the morning and after they leave at night. And so I could really get a feel for this person and study what he was doing, because he disappears and then he reappears as president, and you wonder, what is Washington doing? He spent 9 years without pay or leave during the Revolution. In grave danger in some of these battles. Toughening it out at Valley Forge and at Morristown, which was even worse. He was very close to his men. He was very close to especially his officers' corps. He never went into battle without hearing all of their ideas. He was that sort of a leader. He was a political general. It had to be to pull those warring states together and to deal with the French. And that way he was more like an Eisenhower than a Patton. An Eisenhower who got during during World War II, Eisenhower getting de Gaulle and Churchill and Montgomery and Patton to all work on the same team. I mean, that's tough. Imagine if MacArthur had been given that job. It would have been a disaster. And Washington was more like an Eisenhower than he was a MacArthur. He listened. He always listened, compromised, tried to get all the advice. And so he was back there. What was he, just sitting back there at the plantation, tending his farm for 6 years with everything he fought for was collapsing, and he knew it was collapsing? No. So I went back to study that period. Now, and that's what this book's about. That period that even in his biographies, people just talk about him as a farmer and sort of skip over his role as a leader. And what I found is that he was tremendously involved during that 6 years. He was writing literally hundreds of letters a month, most of which we have. He was to different political leaders, different state leaders, saying, what are we doing? To his friends back in France, like Rochambeau and Lafayette. What is happening? Only a Tory, some of his letters are right, only a Tory, only a Brit could have predicted this. We were trying to do something different in America. We were trying, and he always used this phrase, we were trying to create a government of the people. There's never been one, and not at a continental level. There had been, they knew the Swiss cantons, you had these tiny little villages in Switzerland that were where they did have some sort of a functioning republic or democracy. You had the city-states maybe in Greece, depending on how you interpret those stories. You had the Doge elected in Venice, but everything else is run by the aristocracy. The rest of the world is monarchies, is theocracies, is ruled by dogma, ruled by, and Washington was a child of the Enlightenment, as was Franklin, as was Jefferson, as was Adams in his own way. So many of these people, even Hamilton, the others, and the Enlightenment thought of this idea that people voluntarily form. You can read Locke, you can read Rousseau. People should be what's important, not the king, not the aristocrats. People should be what's important. How do we have a government of the people? Now, what Lincoln later added, by the people and for the people. Washington didn't say those, but he always wrote, we're trying something new under the sun. That was a phrase they used. That's on the back of our $1 bills. Something new under the sun is in Latin there, but it was the motto of the country. This is something new under the sun. They had that perception. Government of the people, where the leaders would be called by the people, rule. And it was all collapsing. And Washington would write these letters. He's pleading, how about a Tory or a Brit? This is just what they said. They said it could never work. They said you have to have a king. The church has to back your government. You can't have separation of church and state because you can't have an effective government unless you coerce the people through religion and get the religion behind it. So you had this where the bishops worked closely with the kings, or you just had a theocracy of some sort. You had some of those in some places. You had a military rule. We're trying to do something different, and it's all failing. And so I'm looking at this period where Washington's struggling with that. And you see his letters to Hamilton, to Madison, to John Jay, and to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson and Washington were very close during this period. Madison was very close with Jefferson. They broke later, but this time they were very close. They were working on the same page. To the Pinckneys in South Carolina, to the Morrises in Pennsylvania, trying to figure out what could be done to create an effective national union, and what powers had to be done. So I was able to follow this period, and I was able to see sides of Washington you don't normally see. Those sides are when he's in power, when he's the general, or when he's the president, he has to play a certain role. And we sort of see him that way. He's like a wax figure to us. Unlike Jefferson, we can sort of feel a little bit. And we can sort of feel Lincoln. But Washington, for most people, is like this wax figure, like this up on the Mount Rushmore, or that terrible picture on the $1 bill, where he looks so distant with those horrible false teeth with the bulging sides, and you wonder, how can anybody be close to him? But this is a period when he's out of power, when he's on his plantation, which he loves, where he's going to the frontier to visit his frontier properties, and he can be like a kid again, like he was when he was a surveyor. So he's in his 50s. He's the most famous person probably in the world, certainly the most famous person in America, a celebrity like none other.